Hello and thank you for joining me, ghouls and gals, on such a spooky night. It is October, which is traditionally the time that we like to tell frightful stories and scare ourselves silly with horror movies. But as is my opinion of a lot of artistic mediums, or at least the ones that I think are worth consuming at the very least, horror often has quite the message for us. The question though is whether or not we're listening. So in this particular episode of Jackie Fox After Dark, I, your host, Jackie Fox, as long as my counterpart Ellie, who will be with me later in the episode, because, she's way more of a horror kid than I am, so, that's going to help a lot. But I'm looking at this from maybe more of a class lens, and then she'll be looking at this maybe from more of a traditional horror lens. But the first of these questions that I want to bring up, specifically, I want to talk about zombies and vampires, because I think that these really define the end points of the class dichotomy within horror. One of the big things that horror had to say, one of the first things actually that horror had to say, and said very consistently, it said through zombies, and this was a critique of the horrors of slavery. A critique which I find to actually be especially powerful now, and it's actually really unfortunate that the whole zombieism as slavery narrative didn't live past George Romero. Although most people who go back and watch films like White Zombie, I don't know, thank George Romero for inventing the modern zombie. Even though it's different, it still has a point, there is still a point to be made by modern zombies, but it's not the same. Now, the tradition could also be found as connected to island voodoo. And this voodoo culture was one that was popular among, I believe, French slaves, typically. It was, just to kind of contextualize a little bit of slave history, the French did most of the slavery that existed on islands. So, the French really liked colonizing islands, and who wouldn't? I mean, really, if you're gonna colonize anything, why not get the islands? But the French were very big on this, so there's a lot of, island nations of very black people who speak French or have French accents or French something or another in their culture. And it's because at one point they were French slaves. It was, in some cases, even the French who brought them to those islands to begin with. But France, as well as most of Europe, actually gave up... the world, for the most part, as I understand it, actually never gave up the practice of slavery. But on paper, Europe stopped doing slavery, I believe, in the 1800s. Early 1800s, by the way. And then America, on paper, we got rid of slavery in the late 1800s. Although it is still worth noting that most American states still allow slavery as an acceptable punishment for a crime. And because of that, because of our world's largest prison population that we have in this country, it's also very likely that America has the most slaves in the world, I would say. I mean, I think that would be a good guess. I've never really seen any hard numbers on, how many Americans that are in prison are slaves, are used for slave labor. But it is legal in, most of our states, I'm pretty sure, and most of the states that are really into the prison industrial complex, such as Mississippi, for instance, are also really into using their prisoners as free slave labor. And then the companies that benefit from the slave labor, of course, they lobby for it. So the horrors of slavery never really ended. And I find older zombie films like White Zombie being one of the more iconic Bela Lugosi films, where Bela Lugosi plays essentially the stand-in for a plantation owner. And I think in a lot of this era of zombie film, where it was all island voodoo zombie, a lot of the voodoo doctor that was leading the zombie army, that was enslaving them to his will, A, was a man, B, was a white man, and C, typically had a plantation, or was a plantation owner, or used them to work a plantation. In White Zombie, we can actually see slaves milling grain, and zombies milling grain. Sorry about that. Just a mental slip there. Also, specifically, in White Zombie, there are a number of white zombies. These all seem to have privileged positions among the zombies, because there are also a lot of black zombies, and these are the ones that we see doing physical labor, whereas the white zombies are more like personal bodyguards or, the attack crew or whatever. They're the thugs, right? They have a relatively privileged position as a zombie slave. They're not the ones that are working and sometimes even falling into the mechanics of the machines that they themselves operate. So, personally, I find that zombie films, from their very beginning, had a deep root in the oppression and the exploitation of a group that was, at the time, even lower than most of the working class. Even though, a lot of these films were from that period that was technically following slavery, and I'm not sure if it was ever this apparent in any of those films, as I haven't watched a lot of them, but they existed pretty much until Romero started making zombie movies, and were fairly popular in their day. I'm not sure that any of them were as overt as to say that this was how the voodoo doctor continued to run his plantation after he had to free his slaves, or how slavers are working around the change in laws by just enslaving people with drugs. But that does seem to be what most of these movies are about when you read the synopses, or, again, having watched White Zombie recently, that really just made it pretty blatant. All of the stuff that I talked about, all of the hallmarks of how this is very definitely a horrors of slavery metaphor, and, the real horror of those zombie films is that you too, as the self-insert for the main character, you too could become a slave. That's the real psychological fear of being a zombie. At least before Romero popped in. So before I get into the Romero age, we still have a number of things to talk about from older horror. So the first thing to talk about is pre-code Hollywood. And you're probably asking yourself, wait, what? What code? What are you talking about? And what I'm talking about was popularly known as the Hays Code, but also the Motion Picture Production Code Censorship Guidelines. This was pushed for in the late 1920s and eventually established the Production Code Administration to oversee it. Before that date, film had been restricted more by local laws and negotiations between the Studio Relationships Committee and the major studios, popular opinion as well, more so than by strict adherence to the Hays Code, which was up until 1933 or 34, I believe, pretty much ignored by Hollywood, even though it existed, I think, starting in 1929. Before the Hays Code, movies could include any of the following things, which were subsequently banned by the Hays Code, including implied sexual innuendo, romantic or sexual relationships between black and white people, so no race mixing after 1934, mild profanity, illegal drug use, promiscuity, oh my, prostitution, infidelity, which really fucks up a lot of storylines within the romantic comedy framework, abortion, oh no, some things never change, intense violence, and, oh, wouldn't you guess it, homosexuality was absolutely banned by the Hays Code. And there were movies prior to this time that were, relatively woke in all of these respects. I mean, maybe that's the wrong terminology to use, given it was still the 1920s and 30s, but compared to a lot of the things that came directly after it, it was a big difference. And with White Zombie being produced in 1932, It would have technically been subject to the Hays Code, however, it was still a movie that was released pre-enforcement of the Hays Code. Unfortunately for this particular podcast, the Hays Code doesn't play much into White Zombie, and it was, to a degree, starting to die by the time we got to Romero. But it is still a really interesting point in Hollywood history that I think is especially interesting to look at now as we are kind of re-entering this same sort of gilded Victorian era and our weird prudish sensibilities of a time like that. Moving back to horror though, and jumping across the pond a bit, I'll include this article because I thought it was really good. It was an interesting working class perspective on horror and how, quote, horror smashes the denial and suppression of British society in both subtle and stark ways. It pulls the darker sides of human emotion into focus, something the British stiff upper lip culture can't handle at all. But also, horror by its definition is a denial of a reality, of everything being okay, and is a perfect vehicle for channeling societal fears, issues, and grief, especially for the working classes, who oftentimes make up the majority of the people working on these films to begin with. As a counterpoint to the Hays Code, our author here talks about the Thatcher government and the video nasties list that was made in the 1980s, banning horror films that were deemed inappropriate for public viewing. This is kind of like book banning today, except that there was this thing called videotapes that we used to have. I'm sorry, some of my audience is going to be too young to understand that reference, but in the 1980s, they were just, it's kind of wild to imagine like horror films being like a black market good that was smuggled all throughout the country, but hey, Thatcher's fucking weird, okay? And, these nice liberal fascists, aren't they lovely? And, this is also the video nasties list falls around the same time as similar efforts by Nancy Reagan were made in order to get us the parental guidance labels that we see on musical albums of today. But also, I don't even think that was her intention. I think she just wanted to ban them outright, and that ended up being kind of the middle ground that was reached. The article asks, so why this hysteria around horror? Why the fear of who could watch it? It's the consequences of working classes having channels to focus their trauma and find alleviated ways to deal with their emotions. A working class to an upper class government is only as good as its exhaustion. Horror revitalizes, challenges, and satirizes everything our country violently insists it stands for. Horror shows England's underbelly, and Britain is a fan of restraint. Horror resonates deeply through the eye of the other. Working class communities have always been treated as such. Sometimes it's not overt joy that you need. Joy can be manifested in being understood. Horror understands us. It puts us into characters that we choose to relate to or not. It gives us a chance to represent ourselves and our communities, and silently, it asks us for the opportunities. It doesn't assume, like the media, that we need to be spoken for. It reaches out its hand and offers to take us on a journey, and often, we take it. Returning to America, though, there's actually a really interesting connection to even more recent enjoyment. That is noted that there are more people tuning in to Walking Dead right now than football. The NFL is less popular than a zombie show. So why are so many Americans so fascinated in zombies, even more so than our common cultural fascinations of football? I mean, football is supposed to be as American as apple pie and baseball. The football that we play, not the soccer stuff that other people call football. Anyways, let's not talk about America's cultural appropriation or the way that we name things. It's football. Even though we very rarely touch the ball with our feet compared to the game where you kick the ball around, which is called soccer. Anyways, it is interesting that the popularity of zombies increases at the same time as economic anxiety, with this perhaps being more than a coincidence. Adam Lowenstein, author of the book Shocking Representation, Historical Trauma, National Cinema, and Modern Horror Film, sees zombies as our most working class monsters, considering that they're not very glamorous, they're dirty, they're broken, they're disgusting, and they don't have much going for them individually. But in a mass, they're a terrifying threat. Of course, the counterpoint to this is the vampire. Daniel Bernardi, the professor and chair of the cinema department and director of the Documentary Film Institute, San Francisco State University, believes that the vampire, like the zombie, is a character that can represent a multitude of ideologies. According to him, the history of the According to him, the history of the vampire movie moves from anti-Semitism and homophobia to some blood libel. I forgot about that. Yeah, I guess that would be the origins of vampire shit. To some progressive sort of gay politics and issues of race, to eventually to gender bending and sexual expression, Bernardi says. Although he adds that vampire films act as a wonderful historical vehicle for filmmakers to place all kinds of contemporary ideas into, so that the films, although they are about vampires and things that aren't true, resonate powerfully and emotionally with audiences. Looking back at Lowenstein, though, he says the vampire is among the most aristocratic monsters, very glamorous, very sexy, and very often wealthy. Whereas zombies are low on the economic ladder. They represent the everyman. Whereas, like from the very beginning with vampire tales, we always see them as like Count Dracula, someone who actually has a title of owning land and having power. Someone who holds their wealth above others, but also particularly someone who perhaps uses their wealth as a way to prolong their own life, or at least I believe that's the metaphor. And the wealthy are getting pretty fucking on the nose with this these days.
Hello, my name's Jesse Karmazin, and as you heard, I'm the founder of Ambrosia, and we're a company interested in making you young again.
Which is a good pivot because his career as a doctor wasn't really going too well. He was barred from practicing medicine after a mysterious incident in Massachusetts, but we don't know what that was or why. But you know what? We don't need to know. It's probably irrelevant. Here he is talking about an intrusive medical procedure that promises to make you live forever.
Elizabeth Bathory was actually executed for bathing in the blood of young women. And as our science is now demonstrating, well, there probably was a fact to these vampire legends. It probably works.
This guy funds every far-right political candidate he can find, and on top of that, he designed the world's most terrifying surveillance tool for the CIA, which he calls Palantir, which is not too dissimilar to his other projects. But if his resume wasn't blood-soaked enough, he also contacted Ambrosia to become a vampire.
And you think that you may live to 120?
I certainly hope to, yes.
Trying to live for a very long time. You've invested in a number of these companies. There have been articles about you with young blood and doing all sorts of crazy things.
See, now I know how Alex Jones feels. Once you find out about these vampires, you start seeing them everywhere. I can't even have a nice evening to myself for a little bit of, me time without seeing vampires.
This intimate of a setting where you're exchanging biofluids.
I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm excited.
I'm just grateful that we're connected as a family.
You just end up getting a video of a guy harvesting his son's blood to see if it'll make him younger.
What a great experience. You feel the love?
Yes. Right.
This guy's actually a YouTuber, and we invited him to collab on this video.
For the 100,000th subscriber, I will give you 1 liter of my plasma. Subscribe below.
His name is Brian Johnson. He's the ex-CEO of Venmo, and just like the other millionaire tech bros, he's now on a quest to reverse his age.
All you have to do is Google the concept of a young blood transfusion, and you'll see how close modern wealth has become to becoming literal fucking vampires. I mean, they're basically vampires without the fangs. They just pay medical professionals to be the fangs for them. I actually used to donate plasma in a facility like the ones that are described in the video that I'm going to be showing the clips from here.
So now the question is, where's this blood coming from? How does he keep getting access to this blood? Well, apparently he just buys it from blood banks. I didn't even know you could do that. It turns out, since American blood banks are for-profit private businesses, they don't necessarily need to sell the donated blood to hospitals for, boring things like life-saving medical treatments. No, they just sell it to the highest bidder, which oftentimes happens to be dumb, rich vampires. Which sounds wild, but it gets even crazier. The US is also one of the only countries in the world that pays people for blood donations, which actually sounds kind of nice, until you think about it for about 5 seconds. You see, these blood banks are pretty much exclusively located in the poorest parts of America. If you're struggling to make ends meet and you come across a billboard saying, "We'll literally buy your blood," chances are you're going to start draining as many litres of blood as you can, which is great for the blood banks. With a dwindling social safety net, every time there's an economic crisis, the blood industry's profits essentially quadruple. It was worth $4 billion before the GFC, and now after COVID, it's worth $48 billion. So how long have you been donating plasma?
I've been on and off for about, I would say, 10 years.
Wow. Oh, veteran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like? Is it...
So they stick the needle in your arm. You never get used to getting poked.
And you'll probably feel a little dizzy.
Feeling woozy or lightheaded?
I mean, I try to take a break like 3 to 6 months in between.
Yeah.
Because your arm gets kind of tired after a while.
Yeah. Now, everyone seemed to be here for the same reason.
So I just been coming here, make ends meet.
It helps get bills paid for the most part.
It helps pay off some bills.
Everything's so expensive here, so like the food has gone up, prices, the gas. And obviously if you're rich, you don't need to do it, but
yeah, right.
But it's good for people who are trying to make ends meet.
Yeah. So these people resort to selling their blood to make ends meet. But the wild part here is that everyone we spoke to was already working a full-time job.
I have a full-time job as a security guard, so this is just something to help me have a little bit of extra money.
When I first started, I had first graduated high school, and I worked at Macy's and I worked at Burger King.
Yeah.
While we're at a restaurant?
I'm a caregiver.
Oh, wow.
So I like my job. I like helping people. So
Yeah. No, it's always so nice helping people. I guess it just doesn't pay.
yeah.
Yeah.
You would think it'd pay more, but it doesn't.
Should. Yeah.
And a lot of soldiers do it too. Like around military bases,
Yeah.
they have plasma centers because the soldiers don't make enough in the army.
So
It really did capitalized on the poverty and the desperation of all of us. You don't see these in good neighborhoods, but you do see them pop up near, unless that neighborhood happens to have a college in it, because, college kids are broke too. And they've got that youngest of blood. Oh, broke college kids, you're gonna make me immortal. Is presumably what I think all these wealthy people are thinking. The sad part is that none of this actually does anything. So they're literally draining the blood of the poor for nothing? To undergo an expensive optional medical procedure while the victims, who they have literally drained the blood from, can't even afford a basic medical procedure? They can't even afford to fucking eat without selling their own blood plasma and having a needle the size of a fucking rose stem shoved into their arm twice a week, if not more, if they'll allow it. I hate to inform you all that, as it seems, vampires do seem to be real, even though they're not nearly as glamorous as our fictionalized versions of them indicate. And there's even kind of a crossover point here with vampires and familiars or ghouls. There is a distinction made between ghouls and zombies, and ironically, one of the people to most iconically make it was actually George A. Romero. In The Night of the Living Dead, etc., he claimed that his monsters weren't zombies, but in fact ghouls. And technically, given that this was prior to him at least, there was no real context for the zombie outside of the island zombies. He redefined what zombies could become by changing everything about the equation for them, but he didn't think of them as zombies at first because, you know, he thought of zombies as being like that, the things from White Zombies, this metaphor for slavery. Instead, Romero was, well, I mean, it's still about economic concerns. I mean, to the wealthy, one of the scariest things for them is the idea of hundreds and thousands of people, more than they could fight off with any set of weapons or fortifications, a relentless army that will eat them eventually. Huh. Actually matches up with some rhetoric. I mean, we do say eat the rich an awful lot. We're not necessarily going for their brains. Personally, I'm aiming for the thighs, the quads, maybe the buttocks. I think that would taste good. I don't think their brains would be particularly tasty or abundant, unfortunately. Anyways, I mean, after all, how much brains does it take to siphon the valuable essences from those who are disadvantaged to you? Doesn't take much brains at all. The system is pretty much set up to allow you to do it. It's like walking into a blood bank and asking for blood. It just works. It doesn't really take a lot of thought or ingenuity. Culturally speaking, though, and I'll throw this graph on the screen because it's kind of mind-blowing. Also, kind of wild that this whole piece of research came from Cracked, which just shows what an amazing website this was at a certain point in history. Before it was bought out and gutted and sold for parts by despicable corporate masters who didn't care about us, the Cracked viewer or consumer, or the artists that made this stuff, or the writers that wrote this stuff either, researchers that researched this stuff. But you'll see from this graph that zombie movies get really popular under Republicans, whereas vampires tend to be more popular under Democrats. And I think that this actually represents kind of our base fears about either political party and their leadership. Republicans are often seen as populists, so to a certain wealthy group of people, this could look like an army of zombies coming to tear down everything that they've built. But it's also true that the economic conditions that Republicans tend to create while they're in office also tend to exacerbate poverty and thus make it more, make people more concerned about economics. It's not only that, but in addition to that uncertainty, that fear. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, when Democrats tend to be in office, it's very easy to see them as coastal elites, upper middle class, professional managerial class, liberal middle manager types, and it's easy to see them as vampires who are living off of just sucking all of us dry by extorting from us our labor value to make themselves wealthier. Although, technically, if this really had as strong a correlation as this graph seems to imply, then vampires would probably be perennially popular because, especially with more recent grifter presidents, Donald Trump, I'm looking at you, and, literally everyone in your fucking circle at this point. I hope you all go to jail, and, well, a lot of you already are there, or will be going soon if there is any justice in the world, and there isn't, so I still have to hope that there is, but I guess what I'm saying is, you would think that vampires would be a little bit more popular no matter who's in political power, because they're all fucking fleecing us, aren't they? But it does absolutely represent, but vampires absolutely represent the way that conservatives look at Democrats, whereas zombies absolutely represent the way that Democrats look at Republicans. So, you know, it's two sides of the same coin in a lot of times, and somehow these manage to be, in an odd sort of way, almost mascots of our modern political system, in that they very much represent our fears of the political system as well. And there have been other things that zombies have represented other than the walking poor, desperate and hungry, standing in brain lines, waiting, hands outstretched in front of them, waiting for a handout. We've also had zombie films, even more recent zombie films, especially, I'm trying to remember which, it was a remake of a zombie film. They got stuck in a mall. You know, that's absolutely about consumerism, or at least that's part of the metaphor there. That just like zombies, we march through the malls mindlessly consuming things that are ultimately destructive to the greater societal good, in the same way that a zombie wanders around only thinking about the brains that it will have for dinner, and not thinking about the lives that are ruined because of its insatiable hunger. In this way, there's absolutely an opening for a Marxist reading of both zombies and vampires. In fact, as Karl Marx liked to talk about in Capital, capitalism is approximately the ideological philosophy of capitalism itself. Whereas, and I don't think that Marx may have made this point, but conversely, you could say that zombieism is a perfect metaphorical representation of the horrors of consumerism, where we just blindly consume without any need for our brains, to the point where we have kind of just stopped using them. We just consume. If we need intelligence, we steal it from others. We rely on other people's ingenuity to make our lives better instead of improving our own station. We are mindless consumers. Capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks, wrote Marx in Capital. Elsewhere, he wrote of the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor, and explained that the vampire will not lose its hold so long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. Even Engels referred to the vampire property holding class in his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England. With these allusions to vampire folklore already swimming through the bloodstream of Marxist theory, it's not difficult to imagine a reading of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, or Todd Browning's 1931 Universal adaptation of Stoker's tale, as a parable of the perils of capitalism. Count Dracula's bloodthirst mirrors that of capitalism, where Eros and Thanatos commingle, both desire and drive for death. The vampire's continual need for possession and consumption resembles the ravenous thirst of capital, and the thirst it conjures up in those under its spell. Although, as a departure to this particular point, I would actually say that this really makes the whole the vampire / thrall, familiar, ghoul, slave metaphor make a lot more sense. If the vampire is the capitalist, if vampirism is capitalism, then it is the hunger to continue consuming that it drives in us, to continue serving capital, the mindless trek forward to do the bidding of our master, that is the perfect representation of consumerism, which does the bidding of capital. Count Dracula, like a capitalist, grows in strength through his predation, a strength that increases in inverse proportion to his bite victim's weakening. So the more he drains from his victims, the stronger he becomes, much like the more money that a capitalist steals from both laborers and consumers, or exploits from the taxpayer, the stronger they become, the more powers they gain, the more ability to lobby and telepathically control the consumer through the government. The more of those powers they gain, much like a vampire. The capitalist gets rich, not like the miser, in proportion to his personal labor and restricted consumption, but at the same rate as he squeezes out labor power from others, and compels the worker to renounce all enjoyments of life. Anybody remember the guy who told us that we had to give up Starbucks and avocado toast if we ever wanted to have any money? The guy who just absolutely didn't understand poverty and keeps sticking his nose into fucking political concerns and conversations, despite his obvious lack of perspective. I mean, honestly, this is probably decent advice for, like, the professional managerial class who can afford Starbucks enough to make it a daily routine. But for the rest of us who aren't spending, like, hundreds of dollars a month on fucking designer coffee, you're spitting in our face because you literally don't understand. We already couldn't afford any of the enjoyments of life. We had fucking nothing. And you keep telling us that the only way to ever have anything is to have less of anything. It's astounding. There is the self-replication of capitalist consumerism, consuming consumers who must continue the pattern of consumption, and the enslavement through this replication, which there is in Dracula 2. We become as him, according to Mina Harker's journal in the novel. We henceforward become foul things of the night like him, without heart or conscience, preying on the victims and the souls of those we love best. For the vampire does not merely drain his bite victim of his or her blood. The transaction is reciprocal, though not equivocal, with the victim receiving the vampire's blood in exchange. My blood now flows through her veins, the Count gloats to Van Helsing. Through this exchange of blood, the bite victim also receives the vampire's curse, becoming a blood-sucking vampire, a consumer. Nosferatu. As it turns out, Marx actually enjoyed reading horror tales of people like Hoffman and Dumas for relaxation at bedtime. When he was seeking a compelling image to characterize the attributes of capital, he chose a whole series of fantasy images whose unifying theme was blood. Marx notably used the imagery of anthropophagism and lycanthropy. I think I pronounced both of those wrong. Fuck. Proffering phrases like the cannibalism of counter-revolution and the werewolf's hunger for surplus labor. If he had lived in a later period, it's difficult to imagine Marx not using a different metaphor for capital that would have superseded all three of these iconic images. A metaphor that could incorporate the undead life force draining bloodlust of the vampire, the Ouroboros consumption of the cannibal, and the monstrously inhuman marked nature of the werewolf. The metaphor that would be what we now call the living dead, the walking dead, the zombie. The zombie as a concept wasn't much known outside of Haiti before the 20th century. This was one of many colonial imports, the Haitian zombie prototype of the dead being controlled through witchcraft as a form of slave labor. And this began to affect the American imagination during the US occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934, which is well within the time frame that White Zombie was created. As Lugosi's character himself says of his slaves in the film, they work faithfully and they are not worried about long hours. The horror here is that one could be compelled to work beyond the grave, to become a servile corpse. Thus, the fear in White Zombie is not a fear of zombies, but a fear of becoming a zombie. As the filmmaker Maya Deren put it in Divine Horsemen, The Living Gods of Haiti, her documentary on dance, possession, and ceremony in voodoo culture, while the Haitian does not welcome any encounter with the zombie, the real dread is being made into one himself. Of course, this is not to say that Marx didn't talk about cannibalism within Capital. And some of these references to cannibalism actually fit really well with zombies as well. Capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, blood and dirt. I mean, if he's not describing The Walking Dead there, I don't know what. What separates the zombie from the vampire is its lack of agency, as well as its earthly decay. And this new modern zombie, reimagined as a dirty, mindless vampire, quickly starts to resemble Marx's thoughts on cannibalistic capital. I mean, after all, and this was kind of a weird point for me in researching this, much of Romero's Zombies was actually based on the book I Am Legend, which referred to its zombie-like creatures. Creatures that we would now see as zombies, like as vampires, although they acted mindlessly. This is the kind of mindless vampire archetype that Romero would use very directly to influence the ghouls of his films. So this is very much kind of, they are vampires without a purpose in a lot of ways. Vampires without control or agency. Whereas, it is, for the vampire has more agency. The vampire steals agency. The vampire is a confluence of agency. The vampire almost represents agency in that it can take its agency so freely and use it to control others. I mean, like mind control, telepathy, those sorts of things are common in vampire lore. Those sort of supernatural effects. And, you know, this is a pretty obvious representation of all the power that the capitalist has due to their accumulation of wealth, or in this case, I guess, accumulation of blood. But the blood, sweat, and tears of the working class. In The Dawn of the Dead, Romero's sequel to Night of the Living Dead, the zombie finally fulfills its destiny by becoming the apotheosis of Marxist horror metaphors. In the film, a foursome of zombie apocalypse survivors, Stephen Andrews and Francine Parker, who work at WGO On television station, their police officer friend, Roger DeMarco, and another officer, Peter Washington, fly a stolen WGON traffic helicopter over Pennsylvania, trying to figure out where to go and what to do, now that the United States seems to be overrun by the living dead. They see something in the distance. Stephen asks, "What the hell is it?" This strange concrete monolith surrounded by a field of parking spaces. "It looks like a shopping center," responds Roger. "One of those big indoor malls." They quickly realize what this could mean for them. There's an awful lot of stuff down there that we could use. So, after ridding the mall of its zombies and blocking off the perimeter, building a fake wall, the four, for a brief moment anyways, live a sort of idyllic capitalist existence in the mall. One-stop shopping, Roger says. Everything you need, right at your fingertips. Francine, the lone woman of the group, playing against mid-century sexist stereotypes, is the one least comfortable with this haven of consumer goods. "You're hypnotized by this place, all of you," she shouts. "You don't see that it's not a sanctuary, it's a prison." And of course, she's right. Something is bound to happen, for they have chosen as a hideout a place that these ghouls are drawn to. The shopping mall invites the zombies in the same way that the house invites the home invaders from the strangers. Why do they come here? Francine wonders aloud. Some kind of instinct, Stephen says. Memory of what they used to do. That this was an important place in their lives. These zombies walk around looking for live flesh to consume, visiting places they remember, places that were important to them while they were alive. Whereas the Haitian zombie is burdened by the whims of his bakor, this modern zombie is burdened by his enduring memories and innate desires, driven to satiate an insatiable appetite. While Romero liberated the zombie from the shackles of a master, and invested his zombies not with a function, a job or a task that zombies were standardly given by voodoo priests, but rather instead a drive, eating flesh, here akin to capitalism. Whereas the Haitian zombie is a corpse that has become a servant to a supernatural slave master, the modern zombie is a corpse that has become a servant to consumption. The zombie originated as a slave's nightmare. And with the advent of the Romero-style zombie, this creature has become the consumer's nightmare. When there's no more room in hell, the dead will be damned to shop. And this exact evolution actually stands parallel to a change that was noted in the Communist Manifesto, in which Marx wrote that modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. This conjures an important series of questions. In this metaphor, is the consumer the zombie no longer controlled by the sorcerer, now driven solely by consumption? Is it the living labor which, consumed by capitalism, functions as undead labor? Or is capitalism itself the zombie? Also, it absolutely blows my mind. So I'm reading from a number of articles that are going to be in the description. The research for this was actually really fun, and for people who are enjoying this podcast so far, you're really going to enjoy all of this. The thing that's really fucking with me, though, is that so many of them have ads for Temu, because I'm pretty sure that like online advertising is absolutely cratered to the point where, you know, these are the only options we've got. It could be that I just don't let advertisers online have any of my personal data, so they just throw me the most generic shit possible. But it's really ironic to be talking about, you know, mindless consumerism and the fact that we've all become zombies, slaves to capital, while I'm being served ads for a company that honestly probably uses slave labor. Like, I wouldn't be surprised at all, but definitely exploits artists and designers and, I don't know, everyone in the world that they can to make a fucking buck. So, fuck you, Temu. Fuck you and your ads. Fuck you and your ads. With that being said, this has been basically all the stuff that I want to get out of the way for the opening section. I want you to be aware of all of this stuff. I want you to know this, have this in your mind as we step into our conversation. So feel free to join me and Ellie on the second part of this podcast, which will be beginning shortly. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.
There's always been that kind of moral conservative side that, you know, horror is terrible. It's just blood and guts and, you know, veins in your teeth and, you know, kind of like the Alice's Restaurant of it all. But they really kind of fail to see that horror is giving people a medium to talk about topics that are really hard to talk about because they're so abstract. You know, recently I actually just watched a really good horror movie that tackled grief and parental grief. It was the new Boogeyman movie, and I had kind of been aware that that was a topic, like vaguely in the back of my head, and had totally forgotten about it. And that's not the only one that's tackled like serious issues with mental health.
Well,
and
you had wanted to mention Renfield in here as another one of those,
right?
And I thought that one was really interesting in that it talked about like kind of
narcissistic relationships. Yeah,
that was very much like a relationship drama wrapped in vampire lore.
Yeah, and that's another really common topic is with parasitic relationships and narcissistic relationships, and you know, where people are kind of just seeing overall the blood and guts of all of it. They're not seeing that people who watch horror are using it as a way that they can kind of have metaphors for those feelings, and then they're relating to it through the movie. So even though in Renfield, you know, it's Dracula and his familiar, and, you know, the story, if you're looking at it at face value, is Dracula is just sucking the ever-living life out of his familiar, you know, through just complete disregard for him. you're looking at it as, well, gee, that feels like my boss, or that feels like my completely draining family member or friend. And, you know, they really, they fully embraced that part. They went there. They went to literally a support group for codependent individuals in the movie. I mean, there really wasn't too much hidden subtext there.
Yeah.
There's always been that subset of horror that is very self-aware. The very quote-unquote meta movies, you know, Cabin in the Woods, making fun of itself, being, you know, the monster horror movie. You know, a lot of A24 movies are kind of, you know, they're very aware of what they're doing, and they're really not making any pretext to hide it. But so yeah, in this movie, they just kind of shoved it all out there for that this is a codependent relationship that's also in the frame of a vampire movie that also is just tackling all those topics that you can really relate to, even if you're not the horror fan. If you can get aside from the fact that Nicolas Cage's face is falling off for half of the movie. Yeah, it just, there's so much that you can relate to from the vampire being that, you know, just the ruling class of like complete oppression, and the rest of the workers are just in the meetings going, my life is absolutely miserable and I'm just trying to carve out this little piece of happy an existence, and just ghosted on his boss for like indeterminate amount of time, and next thing you know, the boss is kicking down the doors like, no, I'm unhappy because I want to take over the entire world. I don't care that all you want is to just be able to have a tiny slice of peace and happiness in your little corner of the world by yourself, bothering no one. I need you to make my dream happen, and I'm gonna now take you back into that and use you until you're nothing. But also, I'm gonna tell you how much I'm the victim here, you know, because we all know how much the big businesses are really hurting, and we all hear how no one wants to work, and everyone is just, it's really the businesses out here suffering right now, while the rest of us are quite literally working ourselves to death. But won't somebody think of the businesses? Won't someone think of the billionaires?
Barely make ends meet with this, what, $3 million package.
Right. So yeah, that, you know, as far as censorship, you really have to go into some very either extremely politically sensitive spaces or just extreme blood, guts, and gore spaces to truly get censored.
I guess the official censorship, and I'm always surprised with like how heavy-handed just the government and Hollywood has been over the century before I was alive, because that just seems so unreal to me. But so maybe a different way of asking that would be to say, like, what has caused real controversy? Like, you know, there have been satanic panics, but like, how has horror been involved in that? Have there been any movies in particular that got thrown under the bus? Like, are there any movies that end up on ban lists? In the same way that we see a lot of books getting banned, are there any like ban lists for horror that aren't necessarily official, but, you know, groups that have enough power to enforce these kind of things, maybe keep them out of their state? You know,
I would say
horror dry state or whatever.
Right. I would say it, in my limited experience, I haven't really looked as much into the censorship and banning. I actually see more pushback and censorship with movies that are meant for kids. So more people are up in arms about Little Mermaid and, you know, the new live actions and, oh my God, Little Mermaid is black, than they are about the new Saw movie. You know,
or Tusk.
Right. I mean, yeah, I honestly, I don't remember hearing any outcry about Tusk. I found out about Tusk on like a list of like, it was probably a ranker list of like body horror movies you have to see to believe. So I would say
also really good practical effects. Oh my God.
Right. Where you see more of the issues, and I was listening to something about recently, is kind of the way that they use the what should be non-biased rating systems, so that movie studios will actually buy reviews for films before they even get released. And people rely so heavily on opinions of people like Roger Ebert and all these other, heavy critics, and they're really skewing certain movies by certain studios that then they'll get seen by more people. So they're movies that are like really good, and especially if they have any kind of a queer theme or any kind of, something that's kind of more leaning one way politically, then sometimes they end up being buried because the studios just aren't putting that much work into promoting the movies or getting the reviews. I mean, even seeing that with kids movies, Strange World had no reviews, and Disney was using that as a way to be like, this is what people don't want to see. So instead of censoring the movies outright by saying this is banned, you shouldn't watch that, they're just doing the thing people do with Amazon reviews for a product, where they just go in and they bury it. They'll either give it negative press or no press. They'll focus it on something else, and then the movies just aren't being seen. So because nowadays there are, horror fans, and a certain type of horror fan has become so desensitized to, themes that would get you censored, that if there were to be a list or, don't watch this movie because it is so bloody, disgusting, and violent and gory, that a lot of fans are going to go, I have never seen a more glowing review. Let me go watch it.
The best part and the most obscene act is a circle.
Right. So,
These are the same movies.
And I think that might have come out of the video nasty.
Or maybe not the best, but like the most popular or the most sought out.
Right. Everyone's looking at a way to one up each other. And I know when I was looking at the video nasty list, until I want to say, I think in the 90s, they were still adding movies to it. And as a fan, I was going through it going, I've seen that one, I've seen that one, I've seen that one. And it was kind of like a badge almost of like, how many on the video nasty list have you seen? And I know there's some on there that I don't want to see. There were some on there that I have no idea why they were on the list. But I'm always, looking out for kind of what's going to make a movie stand out. And I think they've just learned that they're trying to censor the wrong thing, and it's just bringing more attention to it. And one of the few instances where they've learned that, because they're still trying to censor everything else and not learning that if they just let it go, people figure it out on their own.
I think I saw something about what you were talking about with Rotten Tomatoes specifically. Like there's been a lot of investigation into them over the last year or so. Detailing just kind of how the studios behind the scenes had kind of pushed things, and it reminds me of the thing that I was telling you about yesterday. That NPR was talking about the whole how you can define, or no, Wall Street Journal was talking about like how you can see Israel as an internet superpower because they have the ability to use a bunch of sock puppets, or basically just a swarm of online opinion influencers, or just not influencers, but like almost sub-influencers. But when you have that many people amplifying a message, that's just how the internet works. You nudge it, and it's kind of a snowball effect too. So you don't need a lot, but you can really amplify things like that. And to a smaller scale, this is kind of the corporate version of that. And movie studios specifically, in their relationship with Rotten Tomatoes and their relationship with paying people to review things in certain ways and paying certain volumes of people to get certain effects. It's really kind of the corporate version of that, like what is literally a war tactic.
Right, it is. And we actually saw that with the Sound for Freedom movie, where people were buying so many tickets and putting out all these reviews, and it was people that had probably never even seen the movie because the theaters were empty.
Well, that was one of those brilliant stupid moments for whoever thought to do that, in that like this is the same type of tactics that people often use shamefully enough to buy their way onto like the New York bestseller list. Was it Don Jr.? Was it Jr. that did this by like selling buying copies through the RNC and just shitting them out to,
one of them, I don't remember,
or something like that, like hundreds of thousands of copies or something, just to prop himself up. Like it's the same thing. They're just doing it with the actual ticket sales. Why? I don't know. I mean, this is, if nothing else, this is a sign that these billionaires just have too much money. They don't know how to spend it. They're just literally both blowing tons of money on the film itself and building the narrative and the production and all of that, but then blowing tons of money just to make it seem like anybody cared. To what? Push a narrative to the 8 people who showed up to the film?
Right.
And make them think it was cool? Because even they see through it. What was the point?
Right. Well, and there are times when it's done very specifically, like Disney did with Strange World, and it's done it to several other movies. I think Big Red was one that they did it to, which had Asian influenced family, and it was addressing the topics of puberty, and they did no promotion. And then they're like, see, no one wants to see people of color in Disney movies. Nobody wants to see us tackling topics like puberty. They want to see the white princess, damsel in distress being rescued. Give me Cinderella, give me Sleeping Beauty, keep the classics the same. And then all of us that are finding it later, well, they've already now released the movie. Well, it's this % rotten or it's this % fresh, even though when you're looking at it later, the scores will change. I know specifically Letterboxd, anyone can submit reviews. I've submitted reviews for a couple of them on a couple of movies that I've seen on there, and ratings will change over time, but they're only going to look at the at the movie release ratings, to look at how successful the movie was, not after they've given people time to realize they even made the movie. So they're kind of doing it like, fine, you want a gay movie? We'll give you a gay movie.
Yeah.
See, look, nobody wanted the gay movie we didn't tell anybody that we made.
Yeah.
Right. They're using it to prove a point that didn't really exist because the point was wrong. They haven't given, or they didn't give it time to be truly proven. So that's where more of, I would say, the modern censorship is, especially with how many indie movies are out there in the film fest. I mean, there's just no way to be really tackling all of the material that's out there.
I guess if there's like a systemic way of making sure that you don't see certain things, even if there's not like a heavy-handed authoritarian dictator saying this is a movie you can't see, well, that is still censorship.
Right. I mean,
just in a much more nebulous way.
This was in the same video that I had watched that I discussed Nimona, talking about the idea of zombie movies being a way to help to control the masses of people by putting or selling the lie, the idea that we need to be oppressed. We need the system to control us.
But that was, I believe that was more specifically in reference, largely, more broadly, to post-apocalypse movies.
Right.
Where, like, the system has collapsed and all of a sudden we can't even fucking charge our batteries anymore.
Right.
Everybody's farming and suddenly we're all riding horses everywhere. Like, we couldn't figure out how to get our cars to start.
But and the way that and I know that they had mentioned specifically The Walking Dead because of just the brutality in there, not just against the zombies, because there's these zombies that are they're killing each other just in brutal ways, but also the extreme violence that the people are doing against each other to survive. So instead of teaming together and having this idea that we're all surviving this absolute apocalypse out there, we can't just fight the zombies. We also have to worry about the person who's going to come steal from me, who's going to take my guns. What a message that one really is for the poor unwashed. That they're going to come take your guns, take your food, take your whatever, and that if there's not a greater power that's controlling people and setting the laws and the law and order of the land, we just all fall apart and we cannot find a way to come together. And there's always kind of that big story arc where they'll come across a town that somehow has managed to find some sense of order, but then there's always the corruption sneaks in whenever the outsiders come in. And because the outsiders have come in, because someone has crossed the border illegally, you know, and now has come in, they've just now brought all the violence. And within 2 or 3 episodes, maybe 6, if you know they're really stretching out the season, they've brought the entire civilization down. They've gone after the leaders, because, you know, if you allow in the outsiders, the interlopers, as I believe Children of the Corn so lovingly like to call them, the interlopers, and they're going to bring down just the government at the highest levels, and then it's just going to collapse and everybody's going to die.
Well, I mean, they did, like, kill their corn god, didn't they? Or set him on fire.
Right. Well,
they weren't wrong in Children of the Corn, at least.
No, in Children of the Corn, it was more of the language that they just used all the time. The interlopers, that was really just a few had just brainwashed the masses that, you know, but I'm thinking more of, you know, in that Walking Dead where you had the governor or Negan or whoever has their own little society that they have built up under their own law, and everything seems, especially in the governor arc, I mean, it is as idyllic as you can get with the zombies. You can tell because, like, you know, everybody's they don't have any guns, they're able to focus on farming, they're living this relaxing life. As soon as they let that main party come in, as soon as they let the outsiders come in, by the end of the season they've destroyed the society. And it doesn't matter that I'm pretty sure this is the governor that had people's heads in jars. That doesn't matter. What matters is the outsiders were the ones that led to the collapse. You had mentioned about the zombies and the vampires really being representative of the way that our ever so highly functioning, quote unquote, political system just looks at each other. And really it's in the worst way possible, and how they're kind of representing the two absolute sides. So if you're talking about zombies and vampires representing the complete, you know, dichotomy of horror, you know, the complete opposite sides of the spectrum, it really is the complete opposite sides of the spectrum when you're looking at it politically as well. And that, you know, if you're looking at the way that the zombies would be representing the blue collar, you know, part of the spectrum, that they're the, you know, the lower class, quote unquote, that's how a lot of the more conservatives, they see themselves as that blue collar. They're the hard workers.
Or at least that's how they have to sell themselves.
That's how
they want other people to see them.
Right.
I don't think they actually see themselves that way at all. But
no.
They know they gotta get their gun and shoot off menacingly into the distance.
Right. So they pride themselves, right? The pickup truck, the guns, the blue collar worker, that they are the poor masses of America. And if you look at the way that the Democrats are looking at them, that they are just, at least the party themselves, would just be shambling idiots who can't act unless they have someone, the greater system, you know, directing them, to tell them, to feed them their every move. You know, and if you're looking at our current system, I mean, we can't even, right now we have one part of the government just completely in secret meetings with each other, just trying to get it together to even figure out who their next leader is. We have a leader who's just an ex-leader of that side, who's just really doing everything he can to just hype up those masses. Don't think, just keep looking at me. You know, I just look at me as the, you know, uncontested leader in power, because as soon as you question it, the entire house falls. And then once the house falls, now, because you have completely disempowered everybody, you have, you know, whether it's through the way that, like through gerrymandering and voting areas and everything, you have taken away everybody's ability to even put any kind of a leadership team in together, that they really are now just zombies doomed to shamble around until someone else that is charismatic enough, that is, you know, a strong enough force can come in, and then they'll just, without question, that's who the next person that we're gonna follow. When you're talking about the negative stereotypes, the Republicans aren't the only ones that were brought to mind. I mean, when you start talking about the vampires, and this is the one that really sucks the most to talk about, because you really get into shitty topics there.
Yeah.
But particularly in the last, we'll just say several years, you think about all of the conspiracy theories and all of the like almost supernatural level of accusations that have been hurled at Democrats, and then look at like the supernatural level powers that are put on vampires. Mm-hmm. And it really, you start to see some strong parallels that become incredibly troubling when you look into where like the story of the vampires came from, especially when you look into things like blood libel, and you look into where it started as like, this is a way that we're going to hunt down a certain subset of people because we're going to claim that they're eating Christian babies.
Are you saying that George Soros is a vampire?
All I'm saying...
Are you saying that someone believes that people believe that George Soros is a vampire? I'm sorry.
But you listen to the things that come out of QAnon, and you hear them talk about them drinking the blood of babies, mm-hmm. and having cabals and all mm-hmm. of these like things that you really have to wonder, like, where are you getting this from? Because no normal person is like...
Even I don't know, like, this has always kind of been in the back burner and kind of intersectioned with whatever the popular current conspiracy theory is. Mm-hmm. Like, I know in the 90s and 2000s, it was like Illuminati's, fuck the
right.
Rothschilds, in the Fed, and all that stuff. And that was all about, like, all these... I mean, I'm not saying it's all Jews, but it's all these Jewish families that control everything. They're the
right.
problem. It's not all Jewish people, though. It's just all the Jews that control the Illuminati.
It's all the ones with space lasers.
Exactly.
But that's what I mean. Like, everything
it's not the Jews. It's the vampires with the long noses and the Jewish habits. I don't know how else to say it, really.
Right, and it really becomes troubling too when you look at, typically which party is going to attract more people of color, which is going to attract more queer people, more marginalized communities, and then you're looking at the really just racist stereotypes and which party that those are being put towards. And
well, it hasn't stopped in a lot of ways being a good populist way of scapegoating the problems that are being caused by everyone who's in power. And also a way of kind of trying to assure people who follow you that they won't have those problems
right.
with you, even though you're just going to do the turbo version of all the things that you're
right.
decrying. It's just really easy to say, hey, those people have money and they all have something in common. Can you guess what that thing is? And it's been really, it's been effective since Hitler. He didn't even start it. I mean,
no.
It especially like the origins of the vampire Jew, and there's a lot of like vampire traditions, and this particular lineage comes more from Europe, because the Jewish person was often seen as kind of the other throughout Europe for a very long period of time leading up to the 20th century. So it was always like when they were imagining who this dark lurker of the shadows might be, they gave it the characteristics of the other, and those characteristics often lined up with Jewish people. But you also have the more intentional aspects of things like blood libel and how that easily intersects and how those narratives easily get entangled with each other by the time we get anywhere near like the 19th and 20th century. European style vampire that we're more familiar with. And like there were a bunch of other questions that I found that it was just weird to hear somebody call this shit out and be like, why do vampires have a problem with the sun? I mean, because especially in the Christian mythos, the sun and the sun as Jesus Christ are metaphorically interchangeable.
It's going to burn away the impurity.
It's unholy. Like there's a lot of unholiness in vampires specifically. And why is that? Why is it that God hates vampires specifically? What are you trying to say there? Is there something extra to that? And why those Christian, why is it that a cross can keep them away? Why can't they enter hallowed ground? All of those type of things. It's, and it just seems like common sense if you've been raised in this, well, they're just unholy creatures. That's just how it works. And not like realizing where that comes from and what that could be a dog whistle towards.
Right. And that's so much of that thinking that is not that kind of unlearning unconscious bias that is not necessarily done as much on the side that's making that accusations. And I know that that's been a trend in horror that I think I've seen, at least, and maybe it's just because of the podcast that I listen to that they kind of are looking for those unconscious biases, but kind of looking at, how can we take that idea of these monsters or stories or tropes that really are problematic, whether it's, kill off your gaze, whether it's, that the goblin or the vampire or someone who's always Jewish coded, or, Tolkien got called out that his orcs were, that they were black coded. That they're, and moving away. And Tolkien did that. Tolkien looked at the representation of all of these negative stereotypes of the Jewish people and wrote his dwarves as an answer to that, but then dropped the ball with the orcs. I mean, there's still so much work to be done that, that has been something that I've seen a trend in horror of taking those tropes, particularly the troubling ones. And, I was just listening to a podcast that specifically discusses queer themes in horror. And it was about a zombie movie where the lesbians survived at the end. And that was right. But it's crazy that is so groundbreaking because
usually the girls had to fight it out until there's the last girl.
Well, but outside of the final girl, you never see, you never saw the queer couples get a happy ending. You never saw the queer-coded characters even sometimes survive to the end.
The lesbian never survived, right?
Right.
Even if there was one, she'd be dead at the end.
Right. And that movie was actually really cool because it was actually written during the pandemic and as a zombie movie, and it's Heard. This is going to be on my watch list. They actually had a cure for the zombies, but you had to listen to the scientists. You had to be willing to listen to science and not just what the people with the guns were saying. And so everyone immediately saw someone that looked like a zombie and just was shooting, when all you had to do was, not only did the scientists have a cure, they had enough. It wasn't like Walking Dead where you're always trying to find the destination where the scientists are. In Bird Box, they were trying to find, where the sanctuary was at the end. And this movie was such I haven't seen that yet in a zombie movie, where basically it was like an infection. It was like a bad case of herpes, I guess, because they had like really bad pustules. The scientists had created a solution, but the masses, whether it was through disinformation or their own distrust of the system, they didn't trust the medicine, and they were just going to kill each other
I feel
instead.
like that's a really meta take on some of the zombie metaphors, in that you can see the zombie as a way of making the audience take on the position of the other.
Mhm.
Like, the terror is in being the minority,
Mhm.
because it's easy to kill a zombie. It's easy to kill 5 or 10 zombies if you're well prepared. The horror of zombies is there's thousands of them and there's 1 or 2 of you. You know, you have your ragtag group of survivors, maybe 5 of you. If you have a civilization, there's maybe 100 of you. But usually it's just you versus hundreds, if not thousands, and fucking infinite, for all you know, amounts of zombies out in the world. It is the ultimate, like, minority fantasy or way of putting yourself into that role, which naturally for people who hate minorities is a real scary place to be.
Right.
And the idea that a democratic system of people who disagree with you could fuck things up for you is kind of what that fear can be seen as. Because if they feel like they are the minority and the zombies are taking over, I mean, that just kind of writes itself. Especially if they think they're brainless, it's everything they think it is too. So that one actually works both ways.
Right.
If we just all think of each other as mindless idiots, which is kind of what we're being driven to.
Right. Well, and then also look at then who the heroes are in that situation. Look at how many people love Negan's character. I don't know how familiar you are with The Walking Dead. So Negan is Henry Dean Morgan, I believe. He was also the dad in Supernatural. Getting my geek on now. So he's the guy that had the baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, Lucille. And he was absolutely brutal. I mean, just really, he killed people because he loved it. You know, he wasn't like the governor who wanted to set up a society that he could rule with an iron fist, but he ruled it and people prospered in a way under him. Negan was just your, you know, motorcycle wearing, just out there beating people. He said you know, his thing was, oh, I can't wait to feed Lucille. And like, you go to horror conventions and just see how many people are cosplaying as Negan.
Well, like, it sounds like he is a horror villain within the horror story.
Right.
Like, it seems like, and I don't know, Walking Dead fans, tell us in the comments, because I have no idea, but it seems like this is kind of one of those, what if the zombies were the good ones? The people were the evil ones.
The
zombies are just annoying and dumb.
They really did. The zombies, as long as you didn't draw them to you, they left you alone. The people are the villains because they don't have a system holding them down to force them to be decent and put on a suit and go to work. Because I bet you, if you, and I don't know.
If those zombies just got jobs and like didn't have the time to just all day, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Right.
They could be working in Amazon factories like Lord Bezos intended.
Right. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of people that, you know, might relate to Negan because they feel so powerless and they want to do anything they can to just, you know, have their own power. But then to the rest of us, that you look at, it's really what side you're looking at it, because we're looking at it like we already see people in power doing that shit. We see people coming in just trying to nuke the system and just warp it for their own self-interest. And like, it really is down to, as much as you hate to hear it, especially every election cycle, who's the lesser of the two evils, you know? And it really just kind of showed the absolute worst sides of all humanity, and where you thought you finally found safe haven was still more bad hidden behind it once you found the room with the heads.
Well, that's also kind of, since that is like AMC or something, so it was just that serial season after season juggernaut that just kept going.
Right.
You gotta one up. There's always gotta be a darker thing behind the curtain for the next season.
And I don't know, I stopped watching it. I think a lot of people stopped watching it after a while. I think the Negan arc was kind of where I lost interest, because at a certain point it just becomes okay, we get it. Like, there's always a worse bad out there, but they've really have been a lot of really cool takes on zombie movies. I know there was one that I haven't seen just because of the level of brutality. I've read a lot about it, but the Sadness was a movie that came out that was kind of one of those that, had it been made during, you know, the video nasties or whatever, would have been absolutely censored. That would have been up there with, you know, some of the most gory movies. And now people are talking about how it's one of the most gory movies ever, and everyone else is going, well, sign me up, where do I buy my tickets?
Yeah.
You know, and in that one, hate was the zombie virus, really. It was anger. And, you know, it just spread. I don't know if they ever actually explained in the movie how it spread, because it wasn't through bite, it wasn't through scratches, it was like we're being, I think it just exposed to other people. And correct me if I'm wrong, because like I said, I've listened to discussions on this movie, but I haven't watched it myself. And it led these people to doing, I'm not even gonna go into the full depth of the depravity.
Contagion.
Right.
All right. So, given the history of zombies, how about we end this by just giving a quick idea of what we think a timely future zombie story would be like? Like, who would it represent? What would it be about?
I mean, the thing is, how the zombie story is already so timely, especially, you know, when you can make such parallels to what's happening in today's world. I think there have been some really cool things done with some tech horror. Stephen King had The Cell, I believe, which is had, and I don't remember, you know, Stephen King always goes to some really weird freaking places, but there was some kind of, I want to say maybe a zombie-ish effect. No. It was some kind of a virus that was spread through cell phones.
Oh.
So something that kind of, because, you know, everyone says how technology rots your brain, social media. There have been some really cool.
So it's 5G.
Yeah, basically. But no, there have been some horror movies, particularly during the pandemic. You had and I can't think of it right now, but there was a movie. Was it Host? It was all done over a Zoom call. It was a possession movie.
Exactly.
But it was all shown over the Zoom call. So
what do you think a new concept would be for zombies?
It's going to be
something.
It's a virus spread through social media. A zombie virus spread through social media. Whether it's something where you're looking at like a Ring-ish type of effect, where there's a movie that's spread.
Yeah, that was spread through what, like Redbox?
VHS.
Blockbuster?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, something like that, where there's some kind of like a viral, maybe a TikTok that people are watching, and then they get some kind of an emotional contagion, like The Sadness.
Okay.
You know.
Well, let me close it out with my idea. So I'm thinking of making it climate change themed zombies. To where people, it just starts getting hotter and hotter, and our brains start to produce a chemical that just kind of, you know, our brains just kind of break under the heat, and we start boiling alive, and that just drives us crazy in really erratic ways, and it starts around the equator and just kind of works its way up into people are taking refuge near the poles and stuff.